Big Shaq attends his son's graduation, only to be asked to leave by a woman who says he's making people uncomfortable. What follows isn't a meltdown, it's a movement. The cameras captured what they wanted you to see, but the truth was buried until his silence broke the world wide open. When legacy is on the line, and silence is no longer safety, what happens next is unforgettable. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The early June morning brought with it a soft breeze that swept through the tall oaks lining the quiet neighborhoods of Brookfield Hills. Georgia's sun had not yet reached its full heat, but the sky was already gold-tinged, casting long silhouettes over driveways where Suburbans and Teslas sat in neat rows. In a modest, custom-built home on the edge of town, Shaquille O'Neal, known to the world as Big Shaq, stood in front of his mirror, buttoning the sleeves of his tailored navy suit. His frame, colossal and commanding, seemed somehow softened by the smile he wore, one born not from pride in his legacy, but from the anticipation of a singular, deeply personal moment: his youngest son's graduation. Langston had worked harder than most. Shaq had seen it: the late nights, the quiet tenacity, the unspoken pressure of having his father's shadow stretch over every room he entered. Langston wasn't the loud type, didn't play ball, didn't crave cameras. He liked books, jazz, and computers. The kid was brilliant, not in a spotlight kind of way, but in a way that made Shaq's chest ache with love. Today wasn't just a ceremony. It was a reward for every moment Langston had walked into a room where he didn't belong and stayed anyway. The school, Crest Point Academy, stood atop a hill, white stone and ivy-clad, a symbol of generational wealth and elite reputation. It was the kind of place where trustees had buildings named after them, and uniforms were custom-fitted. Shaq had helped pay for Langston's tuition anonymously, not wanting the school to treat his son like a sponsorship. He didn't care for prestige. What he cared about was that Langston had made it through, with dignity intact. As he adjusted his tie and glanced at a framed photo of his mother, Lucille, something caught in his chest. She had always told him, "Walk in every room like you belong, even if you had to build the room yourself." Those words echoed now, like a rhythm in his bones. He was proud of Langston, yes, but he was also quietly uneasy. It wasn't just nerves, it was something older, deeper, a whisper of memory that had never quite stopped following him. Years ago, at a dinner in LA, he'd been seated with a group of executives who kept calling him Shaq Attack like it was a party trick. One had casually said, "You're surprisingly articulate." He remembered the tightness in his throat, not anger, just that sharp sting of being seen through a thinner lens than the one he'd earned. It never left him, and now, standing in the hallway, watching Langston zip up his maroon cap and gown, he knew what his son was about to walk into. Langston gave him a nod, a quiet signal between men who didn't need many words. Shaq returned it with a pat on his son's shoulder, gentle but firm. Then they climbed into the car, not as a celebrity and his boy but simply as father and son. Crest Point's campus was already buzzing. Parents in polished shoes and summer dresses gathered under white canopies with champagne flutes. There were soft jazz melodies playing from the student orchestra, white folding chairs arranged in pristine rows. The guest list included judges, CEOs, and dignitaries. Shaq stood apart, not because he wanted to, but because the glances made it clear he was being measured. He recognized that look. It wasn't awe, it was containment, the silent scanning of whether he belonged. Not in the fame sense, in the social sense. The air here smelled of lavender and legacy. He didn't need to be told out loud. The looks did the talking. He took his place in the back row, wanting to give Langston space to shine. He didn't need attention. He just needed to see his boy walk across that stage. And for a moment, watching the headmaster take the podium and the first graduates begin their procession, Shaq let himself feel joy. He reached for his phone to film, not for followers, not for press, just for Lucille. He always imagined she watched these moments through his lens. That was when he noticed her. A woman mid-50s, draped in a pearl-white coat that shimmered beneath the sun. Her hair was pulled tight, her heels unforgiving. Her name was Charlene Whitmore. He knew her by reputation. Her husband was a federal judge, with a knack for closing off civil rights lawsuits. She was the kind who made eye contact like a dare. She had been staring at him for minutes now. He had tried to ignore it, but the way she clutched her purse closer when he shifted in his chair, the way she leaned in to whisper to another mother, followed by a synchronized glance in his direction, made it clear that this wasn't curiosity. It was disdain, polished and genteel, but unmistakable. Shaq had been here before, in different forms. He knew what came next. Still, he stayed quiet. The ceremony continued. Names were called. Cheers erupted. The students beamed with a confidence only 18-year-olds could possess. And when Langston's name echoed through the courtyard, Shaq felt his throat tighten. His son walked poised, composed, a subtle smile curling at the corners of his lips. Shaq lifted his phone just a little higher to catch the moment. That's when Charlene stood. She didn't shout. She didn't make a scene. Her voice was smooth, practiced. "Excuse me," she said, addressing one of the ushers. "There's a man filming who's not supposed to be here. He's making some of the guests uncomfortable." It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it, with just enough venom tucked behind the silk to sound like concern. Shaq froze. The usher turned. People turned. The music faltered. Eyes darted. A wave of silence, brief but sharp, passed over the ceremony like a sudden gust of wind. Shaq slowly lowered his phone. Charlene turned to him directly, this time with a faint smile that felt more like a dagger wrapped in velvet. "Some families prefer privacy," she added. "This isn't the place for disruption." No one said a word. Not the staff. Not the other parents. The headmaster looked like he had swallowed a lemon. Even Langston, frozen mid-step, seemed uncertain whether to keep walking. Shaq didn't move. For a long moment, he just sat there. Not angry. Not humiliated. Just tired. Tired in a way that reached all the way back to childhood. Back to being told to calm down, when he hadn't even spoken. To being stared at like a question mark. He had worked his whole life to stay gentle in a world that didn't trust his size. And here he was, still the one asked to shrink. Slowly, Shaq stood, all 7 feet of him. Towering. Yes, but not looming. There was no menace in his posture, only quiet surrender. He nodded once to the usher, who looked as though he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. Then, without saying anything at all, Big Shaq turned and walked away. He didn't look back at Langston. He didn't want his son to remember this moment with a broken expression. He just walked, out through the rows, past the whispers, past the stares, back to his car, back to silence. And as he sat behind the wheel, one hand gripping the steering column, and the other resting over his eyes, he realized something. No matter how far he'd come, some people would never see the father, only the figure. But what they hadn't seen, not yet, was that Langston had learned more than just patience. He'd learned where silence ends, and where something much louder begins. The courtyard at Crest Point Academy was immaculate, as if every blade of grass had been measured with a ruler, and every flower bloomed on cue. Beneath an archway of gold and crimson balloons, the class of graduating seniors took their seats, robes rustling like the prelude to a grand performance. Strings from the student orchestra floated in the background, a soft Mozart piece echoing off the school's granite walls, blending with murmurs of polite conversation and rustling programs. The scent of jasmine, hydrangeas, and carefully curated wealth hung in the air. Shaq stood near the edge of the field, just beyond the last row of folding chairs, hoping to blend into the background, like just another proud father. His suit fit perfectly, but his presence never quite did in places like this. At 7'1", he could never be subtle. Not in stature, not in history. But today he wasn't here as an icon. He was just Dad. He had promised Langston that he wouldn't draw attention. No autographs, no photos, just presence. Yet even as he tried to stay low-key, the looks began. Little sideways glances, double takes, and whispered nudges, not just the kind people gave celebrities. These had a different edge, like he was a question on an exam no one wanted to answer. Behind expensive sunglasses and polite smiles, there was the unmistakable shimmer of unease. He could feel it, as clearly as if someone had tapped him on the shoulder. The kind of discomfort that had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with fit, who was allowed to be in this space, and who was only tolerated. To his left, a woman adjusted her hat and leaned closer to her husband, murmuring something as her eyes flicked toward Shaq. Her husband didn't respond, just looked ahead with the firm stillness of a man who knew the rules of such rooms. Others smiled tight smiles, the kind that suggested welcome but never warmth. And then there was Charlene Whitmore. She was impossible to miss. Blonde hair twisted into a gleaming chignon, white gloved hands folded over a leather clutch, a brooch pinned to her jacket, like a badge of pedigree. Her smile had the cool precision of a winter wind, and her eyes had all the softness of frosted glass. She hadn't spoken yet, but her gaze said enough. It swept over Shaq not with fear but calculation, like measuring a piece of furniture in a house she'd already furnished in her mind. Charlene didn't whisper. She stared. Her expression wasn't overtly cruel, just carefully composed, like a portrait meant to look timeless. She didn't look angry. She looked inconvenient. Shaq didn't return her look. He just shifted his weight and focused forward, where the faculty began filing onto the stage, the school's emblem shimmering behind them. He found Langston among the students. Second row, seat 5. The boy's face was composed, his hands resting neatly on his lap, the cap perfectly centered atop his braided hair. Shaq felt the weight in his chest loosen. If only for a moment. This was Langston's day. It didn't matter who watched or whispered. The headmaster stepped up to the podium, his voice sonorous, carefully practiced. He welcomed the parents, honored guests, and board members. He recited the school's legacy, its record-breaking test scores, the colleges secured by its alumni. His words were met with polite applause. Parents smiled. Students fidgeted. Cameras clicked in rhythm. But all the while, the social temperature shifted in barely perceptible ways. Charlene leaned in and spoke to a woman beside her. Both glanced at Shaq. The woman laughed. A short, breathy sound that didn't match anything, said on stage. Shaq saw it all through his peripheral vision. He didn't need to hear the words. He'd lived them in locker rooms, hotel lobbies, boardrooms. They let anyone in these days. Public school star turned benefactor. Wonder what strings he pulled. Where's the mother? Probably a donation behind that diploma. He didn't flinch, but he felt it, like standing on a floor made of eggshells, always one step away from breaking something delicate. These weren't overt attacks. That would be too crude. This was polished racism, sterilized, civilized, and sharpened into something far more cutting. A pause broke over the courtyard as the valedictorian rose. The applause was enthusiastic, her speech glowing with gratitude and dreams. Shaq clapped too, watching Langston out of the corner of his eye. The boy's jaw was tight, his eyes lowered. He knew, he always knew. Then the roll call began. One by one, students walked across the stage, tassels swinging, diplomas handed with practiced elegance. Names were called. Cheers followed. Family members raised phones. Some cried. Some stood. One parent brought a banner that read, "Our future doctor." Shaq smiled at that. It reminded him of Lucille. She would have brought a banner and a cowbell if she could. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, ready to capture Langston's moment. Not to post, not to share, just to keep. But as he lifted it, Charlene turned, her eyes narrowed, just a flicker, and she leaned sideways to flag down an usher with a graceful, almost regal wave. The usher, a young man in his early 20s, looked momentarily confused. Charlene leaned in, and though her voice didn't carry, her posture did. She gestured lightly toward Shaq. The usher's eyes widened slightly, then steady. He hesitated, a flicker of doubt, then began making his way around the chairs, slow, cautious, unsure of what he was walking into. Shaq's eyes didn't move from Langston. His son was only a few names away now. "Excuse me, sir," the usher said softly, tapping Shaq's shoulder. "I was told there's concern about recording. Some families prefer." Shaq turned slowly, not unkindly. He nodded once, a quiet affirmation. He didn't want to ruin the moment. Didn't want his son to look back and see him arguing with some kid just trying to do his job. He lowered the phone. Langston's name rang out. Crisp, clear, proud. Shaq lifted his eyes, no phone this time, and watched his son walk. Back straight, steps even, lips pressed together. The boy didn't smile. He accepted the diploma with a slight nod, turned to face the crowd, and for a fleeting second, locked eyes with his father. Shaq smiled. He hoped it was enough. Charlene leaned back in her chair, a small smile of her own playing at the edge of her lips, the kind that came not from joy but from order being restored. The ceremony continued. More names, more applause, more shallow pleasantries. But something had shifted, a subtle rearrangement of power, a reminder passed quietly between rows of chairs. Even in celebration, not everyone was allowed to belong without question. Shaq remained standing until the end, arms crossed, face unreadable. When the ceremony closed, and the headmaster invited everyone for refreshments on the lawn, Shaq stepped aside, not toward the reception tents, but toward the edge of the crowd, watching. Charlene passed him, still wrapped in poise. She didn't acknowledge him. She didn't have to. Her expression, calm, satisfied, said everything. She had disrupted nothing, and yet had managed to define the moment. Shaq let out a slow breath and turned his face toward the sun, not in defeat, but in defiance of everything that hadn't been said out loud. Something in his bones told him this story wasn't finished. The applause from the previous graduate's family still lingered in the air as Langston O'Neill stepped onto the stage, his gown catching a slight gust that made it flutter like a flag finally raised. He moved with quiet confidence, a boy on the verge of manhood, who had earned every inch of that walk. For Shaq, the world shrank to a single frame, his son framed against the school's crest, diploma within reach. He lifted his phone slowly, steadying it to record the moment for Lucille, for himself, for history. In that instant, a sharp voice broke through the ceremony, like a nail scratching across glass. "Excuse me." Charlene Whitmore's tone rang out with controlled authority, crisp and measured for maximum impact. Her voice wasn't raised out of anger. It was raised to draw attention, to summon order, to command. She turned slightly, angling herself so the nearby security guard could hear every carefully chosen word. "There's a man in the back, recording without permission. He's making families uncomfortable. He needs to be escorted out." The word man carried weight, more than just a label. It was a demotion, a stripping away of name, identity, fatherhood, and dignity. The crowd turned. Eyes blinked toward Shaq. Some recognized him instantly. Others didn't, but none of them mattered more than the moment unfolding like a wound. Shaq didn't respond right away. He stood motionless, the phone in his hand still raised. His eyes didn't leave Langston, who had frozen midway across the stage, the diploma still in the principal's hand, his smile vanishing like breath on a mirror. The applause faltered. Even the musicians paused, their instruments hanging in the silence like unanswered questions. Charlene continued, now directing her complaint directly toward the usher and the event security officer nearby. "This is a private event. He wasn't invited by the board. I don't know what he's doing here, but he's clearly disturbing the ceremony. You need to remove him." The words were practiced, polite enough to be plausible, dangerous enough to pierce the atmosphere. All around her, murmurs rippled through the chairs like a collective exhale of discomfort. Shaq finally lowered his phone. He looked at the security guard approaching, mid-30s, unsure, caught between celebrity recognition and procedural obligation. The man looked visibly uncomfortable, but Charlene's tone left little room for nuance. Parents began whispering again, some of them recording, some trying to avoid the scene altogether. The headmaster stepped forward toward the mic, but hesitated. He didn't speak. No one did. The silence was worse than yelling. Shaq's chest rose and fell slowly. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He was trying to understand what was happening, and more importantly, why no one was stopping it. He had been at graduations before, dozens. He had sat in the back, clapped softly, filmed quietly. Never had he been made to feel like a threat. Today he had worn his finest suit, and carried only his pride. He glanced up at Langston again. His son hadn't moved. His face was unreadable now, a mix of confusion, pain, and something heavier. Shame. Not at his father, at the world, at the reminder that even here, even on a day meant to mark his achievement, this old, ugly truth still found its way in. The security guard reached Shaq and spoke in a low voice. "Mr. O'Neill, I'm really sorry, but there's been a complaint. I have to ask you to step outside for now, just until we finish." Shaq didn't answer right away. He looked beyond the guard, back to the crowd, and then most painfully back to Charlene. She was sitting down again, dabbing the corner of her mouth with a silk napkin, expression unreadable. She had disrupted the moment, and returned to comfort in the same breath, like it cost her nothing. Then he turned and looked at the cameras. They were recording now. Phones held by parents, a student with a live stream, someone from a local blog. He saw the lenses, but he didn't move faster or slower. He simply nodded once to the guard, placed his phone back in his pocket, and turned toward the exit. His pace was calm. Not a retreat, not a protest, just the same quiet strength he had always carried, even when the world tried to fracture it. As he passed the rows of white chairs, the applause slowly restarted. Awkward, muffled, a few half-hearted cheers. Langston finally reached the center of the stage and took the diploma, but there was no triumph in it now, no sparkle in his eye. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the principal. He looked only toward the path his father had walked to leave. The ceremony stumbled forward, but the mood had changed. The joy had been siphoned out, like air from a balloon. There were smiles still, but they were brittle now. Glass smiles, stretched too wide, meant to cover discomfort, not joy. Shaq stepped outside and leaned against the stone wall just beyond the main courtyard. He looked down at his feet. He felt the weight, not just of what had happened, but of what hadn't. No one had spoken up. Not one parent had stood. Not one teacher had interrupted. The whole machine had kept moving, and his son had become a casualty of their comfort. He pulled out his phone again, not to check messages, but to look at the last photo he had taken with Langston, a week ago, smiling, arms around each other outside the library. The image burned, not from pain, but from the contrast. That was the boy who had believed today would be his day. Minutes passed before he noticed the buzz. His phone was vibrating. Messages from teammates, reporters, a retired coach. Someone had posted a clip from the ceremony. A short, grainy video of Charlene standing, pointing, accusing. The caption read, "Shaq kicked out of son's graduation for making others uncomfortable." The tone was sarcastic, the kind that told you the poster didn't believe the story. But the comments had already begun to explode. Some defended him. Some asked for context. Others, many anonymous, offered ugly, familiar opinions. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. He thinks he's special. Maybe don't act like a threat, and you won't be treated like one. Shaq scrolled until his eyes blurred, then locked the screen. Back inside, Langston had returned to his seat. He didn't clap for the remaining names. He didn't speak to anyone. His diploma sat in his lap like something borrowed, not earned. The music resumed. The formalities wrapped up. The headmaster gave closing remarks. The students tossed their caps. But for Langston, it wasn't a celebration. It was a wound that had opened in public. Later, as the lawn filled with families taking photos and sharing cake beneath the reception tents, Langston disappeared. No one noticed. His gown and cap were found neatly folded behind the bleachers. His phone was left on the grass beside the fountain. One of the teachers found it, unlocked by a fingerprint smudge. On the screen was a note, typed but unsent. It read, "Tired of watching him shrink for people who don't deserve his silence." Shaq read the message hours later. It was forwarded to him by a staff member who thought it might help locate Langston. But by then his son had vanished into the city. The house was empty. The usual safe spaces, his friend's place, the library, the practice studio held no clues. The GPS location on his phone was disabled. Shaq stood in the doorway of Langston's room, that evening, his hand still holding the phone, the message still glowing on the screen. The light from the hallway cast long shadows across the posters on the wall, the bookshelf full of dog-eared paperbacks, the half-assembled robot on the desk. He knew that his son hadn't run. Langston was too smart, too methodical. He had chosen this. It wasn't rebellion. It was response. This wasn't just about graduation. It was about years of absorbing silence. Years of being told, in ways big and small, that who he was came with conditions. Shaq exhaled, slow and deliberate, and whispered to the empty room, "I shouldn't have walked away." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew it wasn't just that moment. It was every moment he had swallowed a response to protect his image. Every time he had chosen grace over confrontation, not realizing that his silence wasn't just protecting himself, it was hurting the boy who looked up to him for guidance on how to survive. The phone buzzed again. Another video clip, another headline. But none of it mattered more than the silence left in the wake of Langston's absence. Outside, the sky darkened. A storm rolled in slow from the horizon, thick with thunder that hadn't yet spoken. And somewhere in that growing tension, Shaq realized the story wasn't over. The world had watched him leave, but they hadn't seen what would happen when he came back. Shaq walked away from the ceremony, with the quiet weight of a man who'd been here before. Not in this school, not in this crowd, but in this feeling. The path out of Crest Point's courtyard wound past polished hedges and limestone columns, and as he passed beneath the canopy arch, the sounds of the ceremony faded into the background. But the whispers clung to him like static, soft, lingering, and charged. No one called his name. No one offered a word of protest. They just watched, the way people do when they're deciding how loudly they're willing to live beside discomfort. He didn't rush. There was no purpose in haste. Each step was deliberate. Shoulders squared, jaw set, but not clenched. His mind replayed Langston's eyes wide, still searching for some kind of anchor, as the world turned its back. Shaq had taught his son to stay composed, to never give them what they expect, but now he wondered if he'd also taught him to absorb too much. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few cars with engines humming and air conditioners buzzing. He sat down in his Escalade, not starting it, just letting the silence wrap around him. He didn't cry, not because he didn't feel the urge, but because even now, even here, he felt the eyes, the invisible audience, always watching. He looked at his own reflection, in the rearview mirror, and saw not just a man in a fine suit, but the boy who had once been told to leave a convenience store because he'd looked too big for a teenager. He remembered the time in college, when a professor assumed he needed help reading the syllabus. He remembered being patted on the back at a charity gala, and told good for you doing more than just dunks. The compliments always had sharp edges, sometimes they bled, and always, when the moment called for it, he chose peace, because peace was how his mother raised him. Lucille O'Neill didn't raise a fighter. She raised a protector, a thinker, a man who could break concrete, but would rather build foundations. Her voice echoed in him now, clearer than the voices he'd just left behind. Don't let their fear decide your story, baby. Let your silence speak when your strength makes them nervous. It had worked for a while. It got him endorsements. It earned him seats at tables not built for him. But now, as he sat in the heat of the Georgia afternoon, his silence didn't feel like strength anymore. It felt like inheritance passed down to Langston, and maybe that inheritance was too heavy. Inside the school, Langston hadn't moved much. He had taken his seat again, out of obligation, not celebration. The edges of his diploma were slightly bent from the way he clutched it, his hands still trembling. A teacher had noticed, Harlow, a kind woman in her early 40s, who had taught him government and knew he was destined for more than algorithms and GPAs. She crouched beside his chair, gently placing a hand on his arm. Her voice was soft, full of care and remorse. "I'm sorry," she said. Langston didn't respond. "It shouldn't have happened like that," she added. "Not today. Not ever." Still, nothing from him. His eyes were on the stage, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. There was no anger on his face, only that quiet, measured expression he'd inherited from his father, the one that masked disappointment so deep it didn't even need words. Miss Harlow stayed there for a while. She didn't ask him to smile, or to move, or to speak. She just stayed. Her presence wasn't an apology big enough to fix what had been broken, but it was a rare act of humanity in a place built to preserve performance over truth. Elsewhere, in the marble-lined corridors of Crest Point's administration building, the headmaster stood behind closed doors, with 3 members of the board, nervously pacing. He knew what Charlene had done wasn't defensible, but she was the wife of a man who controlled a great deal of funding. The school had always thrived on image, on silence, on never quite saying the hard things out loud. Shaq's departure hadn't caused a scene, but it had become one. People were talking. Phones were buzzing. Videos were spreading. The tension wasn't over. It was only tightening. Back in his car, Shaq finally started the engine, but he didn't drive. The soft hum vibrated through the cabin, but his hands stayed still on the wheel. The flashbacks kept coming, not as memories, but as mirrors. He remembered a charity event in D.C., where a man had said in front of him, "These athletes, if only they gave back like Shaq does." He remembered thinking, "Do you think I'm the exception, or do you just need me to be?" He remembered a brand manager once telling him to smile more in commercials because it put people at ease. He remembered a hotel clerk who had insisted on double-checking his ID, twice because a reservation under that name must be a mistake. But none of those moments had prepared him for what happened today. Because today it wasn't him who absorbed it. It was Langston. And Langston hadn't said a word. That silence. That was what scared Shaq the most. As the minutes passed, he picked up his phone and began to text his son. He typed, "You okay?" then deleted it. "Too shallow." He tried, "I'm sorry you had to see that." Then, erased it too. There were no right words for this, no version of "I love you" that could sweep the ash from the fire. Instead, he wrote the one thing he should have said back on that field, when the eyes turned cold and the ceremony broke. "You didn't do anything wrong. You're not the one who should feel small." He hit send. Langston didn't reply. The echoes of the day were still fresh, still rattling in every hallway, in every soul brave enough to admit they saw what they saw. But in the midst of that hollow aftermath, a shift had begun. Something unspoken was growing. between father and son, between memory and the moment. Shaq knew now that silence could protect, but it could also suffocate, and as he drove off the campus, turning slowly past the marble gates etched with Crest Point's motto, "Excellence through Heritage," he realized that Langston had outgrown that kind of excellence. He was looking for something more, and he wouldn't wait for permission to claim it. By the time the sun cracked the Georgia sky the next morning, the story had already spread like spilled ink across the internet. What had begun as a scattered handful of cell phone videos had evolved into something sharper, more deliberate. News tickers ran his name: Shaquille O'Neal escorted out of son's graduation, after disruptive behavior, framed by freeze-frame images that made him look 10 feet tall and tense. They'd captured him mid-step, brows slightly furrowed, hands held close to his chest as he walked away. But something about the footage felt off. Shaq noticed it the first time he played the clip on his phone while seated at his kitchen table. The video had been cropped. The audio was reduced to murky ambiance. Charlene's voice, the accusation, the usher's approach gone. It looked like he had simply stood up in the middle of the ceremony, towering and silent, and left under pressure, as if he had interrupted some precious moment with arrogance or rage. There was no context, no truth, just the perfect frame for controversy. Shaq's phone rang nonstop. Some calls from friends, others from newsrooms, many from strangers. Some defended him. "We saw what really happened. Don't let them twist it." But others came with venom. "Sit down and shut up. Entitled thug. Keep your drama out of our kids' schools." It was as if the truth had been buried under an avalanche of clicks. And with every passing hour, the lie gained weight. He didn't say a word to the press. He didn't post a rebuttal, didn't schedule an interview, didn't tweet a response. He stayed silent, not out of guilt, but out of restraint. He wanted to believe that people would seek the full picture, that someone somewhere would correct the record. But the noise only grew louder. Talk shows debated whether celebrities should be allowed in private school ceremonies. Online forums accused him of turning his son's graduation into a political stunt. One outlet, known to lean hard right, ran a segment with the headline, "When Giants Throw Fits." The kicker came that afternoon, when a short editorial aired on a conservative-leaning local channel. It was delivered by a polished anchor, with a plastic smile and perfect posture. She spoke with calm disdain. What we saw at Crest Point Academy wasn't racism. It was disruption. Families had gathered to celebrate their children. Mr. O'Neal, while beloved for his career and charity work, chose to make the moment about himself. This wasn't a civil rights protest. It was a man out of place, unwilling to follow rules like everyone else. Shaq stared at the screen, jaw tight. The logo on the bottom corner of the broadcast bore the name of a parent foundation run by Charlene Whitmore's husband. That was the twist of the knife. Langston had been quiet all morning. Too quiet. He hadn't touched breakfast, hadn't asked about the news. His room remained closed, locked to the outside world. Shaq assumed he needed space, assumed he was processing. He gave him time, just like Lucille used to give him space when the world felt too heavy. But space can turn into silence, and silence, when left unchecked, can fracture something delicate. When Shaq knocked on Langston's door just after noon, there was no answer. Not unusual at first. Teenagers slept late, especially after a night like that. But when he turned the handle and stepped inside, the room was still, not messy, not empty, just still. His son's sneakers were lined up under the window. The laptop was missing. So was the backpack. But what struck Shaq wasn't what was gone. It was what had been left. On Langston's pillow sat a folded piece of paper. No envelope. No explanation. Just a few typed lines in black ink. "Dad, I'm tired of being silent. I'm tired of watching you shrink yourself so people can stay comfortable. Don't come looking for me. I need to say things the world won't let us say together. I love you, but I need to be louder than we've ever been allowed to be." Shaq stood in the doorway, reading the note again, and again, the world narrowing around him, until the only sound he could hear was the faint buzz of the refrigerator downstairs. He wasn't angry. He wasn't panicked. Not yet. But a deep, pulsing dread crawled up from his gut, coiling around his ribs like a vice. He opened the tracking app they shared for safety. Langston's location was disabled. He checked his text messages. Nothing. Calls went straight to voicemail. Shaq stood motionless in the center of the room. The boy he had raised with calm, with patience, with grace. The boy who had spent his entire life walking softly through the noise of other people's expectations had disappeared not out of fear, but with purpose, and that was what shook him the most. He walked through the house slowly, scanning for more clues. In the kitchen, the trash was empty. In the living room, the photo of them from Langston's 8th birthday had been turned face down. On the couch lay a copy of Between the World and Me, by Ta-Nehisi Coates. Opened halfway through, the margins were filled with Langston's handwriting. Quotes, questions, notes. Shaq read one aloud, under his breath. What if peace was never the point, but survival disguised as submission? The words cut deeper than anything said on television. Within an hour, Shaq had made calls to Langston's friends, teachers, even Ms. Harlow. No one had seen him. But one of the teachers mentioned something strange. A week earlier, Langston had asked about podcasting equipment, said he was working on a senior project. Something about equity in education, something personal. At the time, no one questioned it. He had always been introspective, a thinker, but now, the meaning felt heavier. Shaq returned to Langston's room and sat at his desk. The drawers were neat, the notebooks stacked, but tucked beneath the second drawer was a USB drive. Tiny, easy to miss. He plugged it into his own laptop, breath held without realizing. Inside were 5 audio files, each labeled with a number. He clicked on the first. Langston's voice crackled through the speakers. Clear, steady, older somehow. This isn't for grades. This is for the people who don't get to speak until someone else tells them it's safe. My name's Langston O'Neill. You might know my father, but this isn't about him. It's about me, and it's about what schools like mine teach us. Not just through curriculum, but through silence, through control, through what they let slide in the name of tradition. Shaq sat back in his chair. His hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from the realization that his son had been building something while he'd been trying to keep everything quiet. Langston hadn't disappeared. He had launched. He listened to another clip, then another. In each one, his son's voice got bolder, more urgent. He spoke about tokenism, about the way schools used black students in brochures, but ignored their stories in real life. He mentioned the funding gaps, the closed-door policies, the unspoken rules that kept certain students in the room, but never truly at the table. In the final clip, he said something that made Shaq close his eyes and exhale. Sometimes, love isn't about keeping someone safe. It's about showing them how to fight when safety is just another form of control. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It rang with truth. Shaq leaned forward and began typing. Not to post, not to argue, just to listen. He searched for Langston's podcast channel, found it hidden behind a pseudonym. Only 3 followers. But the uploads were recent. Hours old. Langston had timed his release to follow the graduation. The first episode was already climbing in downloads. Someone had shared it on Twitter. Then a student retweeted it. Then a local activist. The real story, raw, uncut, unedited, was beginning to catch fire. And suddenly, the viral clip that made Shaq look like a disruption began to fracture. People started questioning the edits. A parent posted the original video they had recorded, unfiltered, complete with Charlene's accusations. The truth surfaced like light through smoke. And when it did, the narrative shifted. The hate didn't vanish, but it lost its grip. Shaq stood by the window, watching clouds gather in the distance. The wind had picked up. He felt the pressure in the air change. His son wasn't lost. He had just chosen a different path. And now it was Shaq's turn to follow his lead. Not to protect him, but to stand beside him. Not just as a father, but as a man ready to make noise. Because peace, when weaponized to keep you silent, was never peace at all. Shaq sat alone in his home office, staring at a corkboard he had hastily pinned together. Printed screenshots, timestamps, and city map segments crisscrossed with red thread marked his growing desperation to find Langston. Each piece told part of the story. A bus schedule from East Atlanta, a podcast upload time from 3:17 a.m., a post from an anonymous Twitter account replying to a thread with the phrase, "We don't need legends, we need listeners." It was the kind of investigative work Shaq had never imagined doing. Not for the cameras, not for a headline, for his son. It had been 2 days since Langston disappeared. Not vanished into thin air, but strategically stepped away, like someone moving out of the frame to let the world see what was left behind. At first, Shaq had searched in the usual places, friends' houses, coffee shops, campus library, but Langston had gone deeper, intentionally unreachable, pulling away like a tide from shore. What made it harder was that he had left breadcrumbs, not as cries for help, but as breadcrumbs for understanding. The podcast episodes were the biggest clue. Shaq had listened to each one again, carefully this time, not just with a father's ear, but with a student's heart. In Langston's words, he didn't hear rebellion, he heard conviction, measured, thoughtful, relentless conviction. This wasn't about a boy reacting to injustice. This was about a young man confronting it. They tell us education is the great equalizer, Langston had said in episode 3. But only if you believe equality starts after the tuition check clears. I've watched black students perform twice as hard to get half the credit, and I've watched our parents smile through it, thinking grace would earn us safety. But maybe safety was never the goal. Shaq had paused the playback and sat in silence. The words hit with more force than any slam dunk he'd ever made. It wasn't just what Langston had said. It was what Shaq hadn't. He thought back to Langston's early years at Crest Point. The day he came home after a classmate asked if his dad had been the help at another student's party. The time a teacher complimented his vocabulary as unexpected. Langston had told him those stories softly, like they were jokes, testing the waters of how much he was allowed to share. And each time, Shaq had answered with calm. Pick your battles, focus on your books, you're bigger than their small talk. He had meant it as wisdom. But now he wondered if Langston had heard it as silence. Shaq dug deeper. Langston had uploaded the episodes through an obscure podcast hosting platform. No name, no face, just the username, Voiceless Theory. But when Shaq checked the analytics, he saw a pattern. Downloads surged every time Langston mentioned Crest Point. Someone was listening. He followed the social media trails, anonymous accounts posting quotes from the podcast, cryptic messages, hashtags that hadn't quite gone viral but were simmering underground. One post stood out. A grainy image of a flyer pinned to a corkboard at a downtown co-op bookstore. It read, Spoken Truth, a Night of Underground Voices. Below the title, a single line, no more waiting for microphones. We build our own. The timestamp matched the same night Langston had gone silent. Shaq stood up so fast. His chair tipped. He grabbed his keys, heart racing. Not with panic but purpose. The co-op wasn't far. It was the kind of place Langston would have gone. Black-owned, student-run, always buzzing with activism and poetry. Shaq drove with one hand on the wheel, the other gripping the flyer printout like it was gospel. He arrived just before sundown. The bookstore's windows were covered with posters, upcoming open mics, justice fundraisers, banned book drives. Inside, the air was thick with incense and stacked with shelves lined with Baldwin, hooks, and coat. A chalkboard menu listed lattes named after revolutionaries. Shaq stepped inside, and the noise dulled. Some heads turned. Recognition flickered in a few faces. But no one approached him. He wasn't Big Shaq here, just a father chasing echoes. At the back counter, a young man with locks looked up from a stack of zines. I'm looking for someone, Shaq said. He might have spoken at your open mic night. Goes by Voiceless Theory. The man didn't blink. You his dad? Shaq hesitated.
Yeah.
The man nodded, slow. He didn't use a name, but his words hit like truth. Sat on that corner stool, told a room full of strangers that his father taught him how to be silent, and now he had to unlearn it just to breathe right. Shaq felt the weight of that hit him in the chest. He tried to ask where Langston had gone after the reading, but the man only shrugged. He's not hiding, he said. He's just not waiting anymore. Back home that night, Shaq opened a notebook he hadn't touched in years. His old journal from his rookie days. Lucille had made him keep it. Said no man should carry everything in muscle alone. He flipped past pages filled with practice stats and sponsorship notes, until he found an entry from decades ago. Sometimes it feels like the world needs me big, but silent. Like my size is only welcome when it's smiling. I wonder what I lose by always holding back. Shaq read the line 3 times. That journal had never been shown to anyone. But now, sitting at his desk, he realized he'd passed on more than genetics. He had passed on quietness, and Langston was done holding it. He thought of calling a press conference, of stepping out and setting the record straight. But that wasn't the right move. Not yet. Langston didn't need protection. He needed partnership. So Shaq started listening. He replayed each podcast episode, this time writing notes in the margins. He followed the comment threads, started responding under a pseudonym. Still learning 77, he didn't defend himself. He just asked questions, amplified truths, not to prove he was right, but to show he was willing to grow. 3 days passed. And then, one evening, a new episode dropped. No announcement, no title, just a voice. Langston's. People ask me if I hate what happened. If I wish I could erase the day my father got humiliated. But I don't. Because that was the day I saw something real break. Not in him. In me. And sometimes you gotta break before you can choose what to rebuild. There was a pause. A long breath. To the man who taught me how to carry the world without crushing it. I'm not mad at you. I'm just not afraid to be loud anymore. I hope you'll meet me there. Shaq sat in the dark, tears in his eyes, phone gripped in both hands. He had spent years being the example. But now it was time to become a student again. Langston wasn't just hurt. He was leading. And Shaq was ready to follow. It was nearly midnight when the email arrived. Shaq had been sitting in the dim glow of his living room, his laptop open, half watching old family videos he hadn't dared to revisit in years. On the screen, Langston was 6, trying to dribble a basketball twice the size of his head while Lucille shouted encouragement from behind the camera. The innocence in the boy's laugh stabbed at Shaq's chest. He had lost that version of Langston somewhere along the line, not to trauma, but to restraint, and now he was trying to find his way back, not just to his son, but to himself. The subject line was simple: watch this before they delete it. No sender name. Just a scrambled email address. The body of the message held a single sentence. You've been fed a lie. Here's what really happened. Attached was a video file labeled Crestpoint Raw Cam 7. Shaq's first instinct was hesitation. His second was curiosity. His third, when he clicked play, was fire. The footage opened with a wide-angle security camera view of the graduation courtyard. The camera, mounted near the admin building's archway, captured the entire scene, not from the crowd's perspective, but from above and behind the podium. It was clearer than any smartphone footage. No edits, no gaps. It began 5 minutes before Langston's name was called. Shaq watched himself distant, motionless in the last row. He saw the parents murmuring, the subtle glances, and then frame by frame he watched Charlene Whitmore rise. This time, without the distortion of selective framing, he heard her words exactly. He's filming us. Right there. Don't just stand there. Do something. She was already speaking to security before she even looked at Shaq. Her tone was sharp. Her posture rigid. Then came the lie. He's not on the list. He's not even a parent, as far as I can tell. I don't feel safe. The words landed with the impact of a verdict, not a question. Watching it unfold in its full, unedited context felt like touching something electric. Shaq's jaw tightened as he watched himself lower the phone, look to Langston, and then comply without protest. But it didn't stop there. The footage kept rolling. 10 minutes later, after Shaq had exited the courtyard, the camera captured Charlene walking to the edge of the stage. She met with a man in a navy suit. Someone Shaq hadn't noticed that day. They shook hands, exchanged a quick conversation. No audio, but the body language was unmistakable. Satisfaction. Coordination. And then she smiled. A knowing smile. The kind people wear when the script has played out exactly as planned. Shaq paused the video, took a shaky breath, and hit rewind. He watched it again, slower this time. The detail that hadn't registered before clicked into place. The man in the navy suit had been sitting in the administrative seating, second row from the front, next to the board chair. He wasn't just a guest. He was part of the school. Shaq reopened the email and found a second file tucked beneath the video. Attachment: Crestpoint admin threads.zip. Inside were email chains, dozens of them. Anonymous screenshots, partial logins, blurred out. The first few messages were benign, faculty updates and seating arrangements. But buried beneath those were threads from a private board communication group. The first bombshell was dated 3 weeks before the graduation. From R. Ashford, at Crestpoint admin, to C. Bigmore donors, Crestpoint. Subject: concerns regarding class representation. Langston O'Neill's academic performance has triggered some discomfort with a few longtime donors. They're concerned about optics. We'd prefer not to highlight students whose last names carry media weight, especially if it could shift the school's narrative too far from its core traditions. Shaq blinked. Another email followed days later, from Charlene herself. I understand. Rest assured, the ceremony will remain aligned with our standards. I'll handle any disruptions discreetly, if necessary. Presence doesn't equal privilege. They need reminding. The most damning message came in the form of a forward. The subject: Langston's podcast background check. An attached note read, He's been more vocal than expected. Pull records, look for university links. We can't afford to let this spiral into another media problem. It wasn't just racism. It was orchestration. Langston's success hadn't just made him a student. They saw it as a threat, and Shaq, once a silent icon at the edge of elite spaces, had become collateral damage in a premeditated performance of control. Shaq sat back in his chair, stunned by the scope of it all. They hadn't targeted him in a moment of discomfort. They'd strategized it, branded it, executed it. He stood, pacing the room like a lion in a cage. His heart wasn't racing. It was boiling, but not in rage, in clarity. For the first time, he understood the full weight Langston had been carrying, and why his son had disappeared, not to escape, but to expose. Shaq grabbed his phone and called Marcus Ferris, an old teammate turned civil rights attorney. They hadn't spoken in months, but now wasn't the time for casual hellos. "I need you," Shaq said, voice low. "You okay?" Marcus replied, instantly on alert. "No," Shaq said, "but I know what I'm doing now." He forwarded the files. Within hours, Marcus called back. "Shaq, if this gets out, it's not just the school on the line. These are federal-level implications. Donor fraud, discrimination, conspiracy." Shaq nodded, already knowing. "Do you want to go public?" Marcus asked. Shaq looked down at the last line of Charlene's email. "Presence doesn't equal privilege. They need reminding." He said, "I don't want to go public. I want to go loud." The next morning, Shaq uploaded the full footage and the redacted email threads, not through any mainstream outlet, but through Langston's podcast channel. The platform still bore the alias Voiceless Theory, but Shaq added a new tagline beneath the title, "Voiceless No More." He included a brief message. "This is the truth. No edits, no apologies. Watch what really happened, and ask why the world was so ready to believe the lie." The post went live at 7:06. By 10 a.m., it had 300. By noon, it hit national trending charts. Outlets that had rushed to condemn him scrambled to update their coverage. Civil rights groups issued statements of support. Prominent activists reposted the footage, overlaying it with commentary about class bias, institutional protection, and generational silencing. Crest Point issued a short, stumbling press release. "We are investigating a series of recent allegations and reviewing conduct related to the graduation ceremony." But it was too late. The fire had already spread. Langston, who had been watching from afar, released a new podcast episode that evening. "I'm not here to drag a school. I'm here to ask why the people who claim to shape the future are so afraid of seeing it change." He didn't name names. He didn't have to. The footage spoke for itself. Shaq didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He spent the evening in quiet reflection, rereading Lucille's old notes. In one, scrawled across the back of a church bulletin, she'd written, "Your name will get you in the room. Your silence might keep you there. But your truth is the only reason to stay." Now he understood. Fully. This wasn't just about what had been done to him. It was about who he refused to become from this point forward. Langston returned home that weekend. Not with fanfare, but with focus. Shaq opened the door to find his son standing with a backpack slung low and tired eyes that had seen too much too fast. They didn't say anything right away. Just a nod. A pause. Then Langston asked, "Did you mean it? That you're ready to be loud?" Shaq didn't hesitate. "I'm already speaking." And this time, the world was finally listening. The storm didn't arrive with thunder. It came quietly, like smoke under a door. No press conference. No bold headlines from his team. Just one link, posted at 7:16 a.m., on a nondescript weekday, from a podcast account known by only a handful before everything broke wide open. A Voiceless Theory posted, "This is what really happened. Full footage, full story. Watch, share, listen." It included no hashtags, no dramatic caption, just the truth. Unedited, undistorted, and undeniable. Within the first hour, the clip had been viewed 20,000 times. By the end of the day, it would pass 10 million. The video showed everything. Charlene Whitmore, approaching the usher before even glancing at Shaq. The exact words she used. The falsity of her claims. Her smile after the ceremony. The man in the navy suit. The emails. All of it laid bare with a single, devastating clarity. What made it even more powerful was that it hadn't come from Shaq's verified platforms. It wasn't tied to his celebrity, his brand, his publicists, or any of the polished handlers who usually buffered him from raw exposure. It came from Langston's space, his message, his term. But everyone knew who had finally pressed upload. Shaquille O'Neal had spoken. And for the first time in a long time, it wasn't with silence. By mid-afternoon, the momentum had outgrown the original post. Student-led protest accounts from elite schools across the country reposted the footage. Civil rights leaders began issuing formal responses. Former Crest Point graduates, long silent, began sharing their own stories of marginalization. One said, "I wasn't brave enough to speak back then. Langston gave me that courage now." Celebrities added fuel, not just with retweets, but with action. An actor known for his activism offered to fund a legal probe. A Grammy-winning artist used her concert to call out the silent schools billed to protect their donors. Even a retired Supreme Court justice issued a statement reminding private institutions of their constitutional responsibilities when public funding intersects with racial bias. Meanwhile, Charlene Whitmore's name began trending, and not kindly. A video compilation of her confrontation and smirking post-ceremony behavior, played on loop across digital spaces, branded the pearls that tried to choke progress. Her husband, Judge Malcolm Whitmore, initially dismissed the story as overblown misinformation, but within hours it was discovered he had sat on the board of Crest Point's donor trust. The pressure mounted. Lawyers began to withdraw. Sponsors pulled funding. A federal ethics review was announced. At Crest Point, chaos reigned behind the marble walls. The board held an emergency session the next morning. The headmaster, who had been tight-lipped throughout, finally spoke during a shaky live-stream press call. "We regret what transpired," he began, eyes scanning something just out of frame. "We are cooperating with a third-party investigation into the conduct of select board members and faculty. The values of this institution are founded on inclusion and excellence. We clearly failed to uphold those standards." But no one believed him, because by then the court of public opinion had already rendered its own verdict. This wasn't just about Shaq. It was about a system built to reward appearance over justice, and obedience over truth. And while the world spun in all directions, Shaq stayed still. He didn't tour the morning shows. He didn't accept invites from news outlets hungry for redemption stories. He didn't even return calls from networks promising hour-long specials. He remained silent until the invitation came from a student forum at a small college just outside Atlanta. Langston had once mentioned it in passing, a place where young organizers held space for real talk, far from press, far from the cameras. They wanted Shaq to speak, not as a legend, not as a brand, as a father, as a man who had been pushed to the edge, and finally decided to speak back. He accepted. The auditorium was packed wall to wall, not with paparazzi or VIPs, but with students, parents, educators, people who had seen themselves in the video, people who knew the way racism could be dressed in civility, and still sliced just as deep. Shaq stepped on stage wearing a plain charcoal suit, no tie, no security detail, just a man with presence. He stood at the podium for a long moment, scanning the room with eyes not of intimidation, but of quiet gravity. Then he leaned in. "I didn't come here to prove anything," he began. "I didn't come here to defend myself either. I came here to tell you what silence cost me, what it almost cost my son." The room was breathless. For years I believed that if I stayed calm, kept my head down, and just outworked everyone else, the world would respect that. And for a while, it looked like it did. I was let in. I was welcomed at tables I never thought I'd sit at. But I didn't realize that some doors don't open because you're respected. They open because you're useful. He paused, scanning faces young and old. When my son walked across that stage, he was ready to receive the reward he earned. And I let someone take it from him, because I thought grace would protect us. But grace without truth isn't strength. It's surrender. He talked about Langston's podcast, about the words that had shaken him awake. He read a few quotes from the emails, cold, calculated phrases that tried to reduce his son to a threat. The crowd flinched at the line. Presence doesn't equal privilege. They need reminding. Shaq nodded slowly. "Well, here's your reminder." He didn't shout. He didn't raise his fist. He let the silence hang. The same silence that had always been his armor, now turned into a weapon of purpose. "I'm not here to be a symbol," he finished. "I'm here to be accountable. And I'm not going back to quiet." The standing ovation that followed wasn't thunderous. It was sustained. It rolled in like a wave, row by row, person by person, until it swelled into something deeper than applause. After the speech, reporters waited outside the venue, hoping for a quote. Shaq stepped past them with Langston beside him. They didn't stop. Didn't need to. The message had already been sent. Back home, the porch light was left on. The mailbox overflowed with letters from strangers, educators, even students from Crest Point, who said thank you for showing us what courage looks like. That week, Crest Point's board announced multiple resignations. A civil rights inquiry was launched. Donations were redirected towards scholarship funds for underrepresented students. And in the quiet corner of the school's library, someone had placed a copy of Between the World and Me with a handwritten note inside. For Langston, you didn't just speak, you moved the ground. Shaq watched it all unfold, not with vengeance, but with validation. He had spent a lifetime learning how to stand still in storms. Now he was learning how to speak through them, and he wasn't alone anymore. They didn't need a stage. By the time the sun rose over downtown Atlanta, that Saturday, the corner of Auburn and Piedmont had transformed into something sacred. Folding chairs lined the sidewalk in tight rows. Banners made from hand-painted bedsheets swayed between lampposts. A local jazz trio tuned their instruments near the fountain. There were no velvet ropes, no polished stone, no marble insignias, just community, just heart, just a street reclaimed for something Crest Point had failed to give. Unfiltered celebration. Langston stood near the center, adjusting his maroon robe, the same one from the ceremony that never finished. His cap, worn backward, bore handwritten words in thick black marker. We graduate on our terms. Around him stood nearly 100 students, some from Crest Point, others from neighboring schools, and a few from outside the state, who had come just to stand with him. Some held signs that read, "We deserve more than silence," or unmuted, unashamed. Others wore stoles embroidered by hand, adorned with the flags of the countries their families came from, or stitched names of ancestors who never got to walk a stage at all. At the far end of the makeshift stage, a flatbed truck draped in cloth. Shaq waited. He wasn't wearing a suit, just black slacks and a simple white shirt with sleeves rolled up to his elbows. No podium in front of him, no security behind him, just a microphone resting on a milk crate, and a diploma folder tucked beneath one arm. For the first time in weeks, he looked at ease. But not because the moment was simple, because it was earned. This wasn't about damage control or media spectacle. This was about what had always mattered most to him. Showing up, not with power, with presence. As the music faded and the crowd settled, Shaq stepped up and looked out at the sea of young faces. Some he recognized from Langston's childhood. Others he had only just met. But all of them had chosen to be here. Not for what the system had offered them, but for what they'd built in spite of it. He didn't speak long. Graduation was never about a building, he said. It was about crossing a line no one thought you could reach, and bringing others with you. There was no applause, just stillness. The kind that wraps around you when truth is spoken without needing to shout. Shaq reached for the first name on the list, and called it out. One by one, students walked across the flatbed, each greeted with cheers from friends, family, strangers. Each handed a folder embossed. Not with the school's crest, but with the phrase, "Voiceless no more." When Langston's name was called, the street held its breath. He didn't walk like a student. He walked like a man who had written his own rite of passage. Shaq met him at the center, and held out the diploma, but before Langston could take it, his father pulled him into an embrace. Tight, unhurried. "You gave me back my voice," Shaq whispered. Langston didn't reply. He didn't have to. Later, when the ceremony ended and chairs were folded and hugs exchanged, a group of students began reading poetry from the curb. A mother passed out cupcakes from her trunk. A local artist painted murals on the brick wall behind the stage. Faces of students, fists of resistance, a skyline wrapped in light. Shaq sat on the edge of the truck, legs dangling, watching it all. He didn't feel like a symbol. He felt like a witness. He knew people would try to name this moment. They'd call it grassroots, call it protest, maybe even try to brand it, but he understood better than anyone now. Some things weren't meant to be contained. This wasn't about rage, it was about reclamation, of space, of worth, of dignity. One by one, parents approached him, not with praise, but with stories, about their kids, about moments they had kept quiet for too long, about their own silences they were learning to break. As the day stretched into dusk and laughter replaced tension, Shaq leaned his head back and looked up at the open sky. No cameras, no ceremony script. Just his son beside him, and a street filled with people who had turned pain into purpose. He never wanted to be a symbol. But maybe symbols didn't choose themselves. Maybe they were chosen when they stopped waiting for permission to speak. The auditorium was packed. Not with celebrities, not with media, but with students. Hundreds of them, clad in gowns, tassels swinging from their caps, eyes brimming with that unique mix of exhaustion, pride, and fear of what comes next. It was the spring commencement ceremony at Southeast State University, a school that prided itself on diversity in brochure and struggled with it in boardrooms. The folding chairs curved around the stage like the edge of a tidal wave, and in the front row sat a tall figure in a dark suit, calm and quiet, waiting. Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq to the world, had been asked to give the commencement speech. But he hadn't come as Big Shaq. He came as someone who had finally learned how to use his voice. It had been 8 months since that graduation day, at Crest Point. The one that never really belonged to them. 8 months since Langston's podcast had shattered silence across school halls and boardrooms. Since the video had reshaped public discourse. Since Shaq had finally walked into the kind of manhood Lucille had hoped he would. Not just strong but spoken. When the university reached out, it wasn't to spotlight his NBA legacy. It wasn't to talk about championships or shoe deals. They wanted the other Shaq, the one who had stayed quiet too long, the one who had learned the cost of that silence. A few rows back, seated among the graduates, Langston adjusted the edge of his black stole, embroidered in gold with the words "Build what they won't give you." He had transferred to Southeast mid-semester after Crest Point's fallout. Now he was a freshman with sophomore credits, a scholarship funded by an alumni grant named after Voiceless Theory, a fund started in his honor though he never claimed it publicly. He didn't need recognition. His voice had already outgrown anonymity. The university president stepped up to the mic and gave a short, rehearsed introduction. But when she welcomed Shaq to the stage, the room shifted, not because a legend was about to speak, but because a father was about to testify. Shaq stepped up slowly, nodding once at Langston. Then he turned to the students and took a breath that seemed to last longer than most pauses deserve. He didn't use the podium. He didn't unfold any notes. Instead, he began. "There's a story I never meant to tell," he said, "and that's exactly why it matters." The silence in the hall grew weighty. No one fidgeted. No one checked their phones. Even the lights felt still. Shaq's voice came slow, deep, measured, less like a speech and more like confession, wrapped in rhythm. "I once believed silence was strength. That if I stayed quiet, stayed composed, stayed out the way, I was protecting something. My image. My space. My son." He took a few steps across the stage. But silence is tricky. It dresses up like dignity. Pretends to be peace. But sometimes, it's just fear with a better suit on. He looked out over the graduates. "I watched my son walk across a stage and get his moment taken from him by someone who didn't even have to raise her voice. She didn't shout. She didn't scream. She just decided I didn't belong. And the world agreed without question." A murmur passed through the rows. Students nodded. Faculty shifted in their seats. I walked away. Because I was taught to walk away. Because I thought leaving was grace. But when I saw my son's eyes, I realized I wasn't walking away from trouble. He paused. I was walking away from him. The words hung in the air, as heavy as thunder that hadn't broken yet. Shaq glanced at the back wall of the stage, where a faint screen displayed the phrase, "Honor, courage, voice." He smiled, without joy. Sometimes you teach your kids how to survive, and you don't realize they needed to learn how to fight. Not with fists, with fire, with truth, with words you were too afraid to say yourself. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, the note Langston had left behind all those months ago. He read it aloud. "I'm tired of being silent, Dad." Then he folded it gently and placed it on the podium. "I carry that with me, every day. Not as guilt, as fuel. Because silence might protect your reputation, but it'll bury your legacy." He stepped forward again, now speaking directly to the rows of students at the front. "You're walking into a world that'll ask you to play quiet. In interviews, in meetings, in classrooms, even in rooms you built with your own 2 hands. They'll clap for you, praise your work, love your ideas, until those ideas get uncomfortable." His voice didn't rise. It lowered, and somehow the room leaned in closer. When that moment comes, don't let them convince you that silence is grace. Don't let them sell you peace if the price is your dignity. Speak, even if your voice shakes, even if you're the only one standing, especially if you're the only one standing. Then came a pause, and in that pause, the auditorium exhaled. Shaq reached up and adjusted the mic, not for himself but for the moment that came next. He turned slightly, looking off stage. And now, he said, I'd like to introduce someone who taught me how to speak. Not with volume, with truth. The crowd stirred. My son, Langston O'Neill. Langston stepped onto the stage slowly, met halfway by his father's outstretched arm. The applause came fast, rising from claps to cheers, swelling into a standing ovation that shook the rafters. Langston didn't bask in it. He didn't perform. He walked straight to Shaq, hugged him hard, 2 arms across 2 generations, finally closing the space between what had been unspoken for too long. Then, as the applause faded, Langston stood at the mic, his voice firm. My father didn't just teach me how to stand tall. He taught me how to stand through it. And now he's teaching all of us what it means to rise with others. That's the lesson I carry into this chapter. The ceremony ended with students throwing their caps not just into the air but into a moment. A moment where a father found his voice, a son built his platform, and a room full of witnesses learned what legacy really meant. Outside, under the soft light of the late spring sun, a mural stood tall beside the student union. Painted just weeks earlier, it showed a silhouette of a man standing in front of a podium, hand over heart, beside a younger figure holding a mic. Below it were 5 words. Truth starts when silence ends. Shaq stood there for a long time after the ceremony ended, watching students take pictures, hug families, chase futures. Langston stood beside him, hands in his pockets. You ready to rest for a bit? Langston asked. Shaq shook his head gently. Nah, he said. I'm just getting started. If this story made you pause, don't just walk away with emotion. Walk away with awareness. The next time silence shows up, dressed as comfort, ask who it's protecting. Keep questioning. Keep listening. Keep building tables where everyone has a seat. Because real change doesn't start on stages. It starts in how we show up when no one's watching.